replied to artfulgiphy.com. Royalty Rodia said give me a theme idea to make and I'll make one. Artful replied to Talise like so many people only played Retro Studio for the Doors collab and that. Royalty Rodia said I have basically the entire SCPCB map. Artful replied to okay bro loudly crying face. Artful replied to Royalty Rodia. Royalty Rodia said with custom levels. Royalty Rodia said specifically stuff to do with a lot of motors since that's fun. 1 year ahead in visits.
So, you made it this far. That's great. I shall grant you a gift for your progress. So just keep going.
Replied to Talise the urge to call you a UGC goblin is through the roof. Talise replied to Royalty Rodia what do you think would be a good change for Retro Studio? Artful replied to Royalty Rodia Tower Heroes Ma asterisk gets shot 57 times. Talise said as someone who uses it a lot. Anymore.
Hello?
Talise replied to Artful I got the birthday cake. Artful replied to Artful it was mostly specifically back accessories or shoulder pels. Replied to Talise I've got a question for ya, what did Roblox not killed off? Royalty Rodia said Adrian. Artful said there's an April Fool's Minesweeper map and its hard mode is the hardest thing in the game as it relies on RNG so harshly, but there was a UGC for it as well. Talise said Enrique Arg next. Replied to Royalty Rodia we just making an ARG of anything. Artful replied to natural disasters. Artful replied to ARG games on their way to look promising but instead look like a 10-minute build. Replied to Artful we all love ARG slop. Said decrypting the same shitty Morse, binary or Caesar cipher codes. Artful replied to I would be so hypocritical if I said I hate ARG stuff. Talise said if trading gets added in a good way I can see more people playing Retro Studio just for that. Replied to MatPat didn't die for TS broken heart. Talise said like. Talise said twice the numbers. Talise said we get nowadays. Artful replied to Talise 400 to 800. Talise replied to Artful on a Monday that is huge. Artful replied to Talise true. E said y'all jacid coping bro, it's not happening. Tolise said Retro Studio already gets 600 to 800 on the weekends. Tolise replied to E, it is. Artful replied to Tolise 1K. Tolise replied to Artful already happens during events. Tolise said I think the most players we got was during the festival. Tolise said crazy to say that. Tolise said it was like 2K concurrent players. E said I loved the festival slop red heart. Artful said I didn't participate in that. Tolise said Mugen alert. Tolise said warning. Artful said I was too busy trying to lock in on fixing 1 million bugs I found in my game. Tolise said don't worry. Artful said and I wasn't too interested as well. E said new gem. Tolise said there is another festival happening this year. Artful said I did the entire extravaganza thing. E replied to Tolise I'm not attending that shit. Tolise said you gotta understand what is going on with the Retro Studio players. E replied to E, media4.giphy.com. Tolise said if trading gets added that means a whole bunch of people are joining just to trade. Artful said I apparently also won the Discord egg rain as number 10 but never got my reward. I was supposed to get wilted flower. E replied to Artful I think you had to contact staff, not sure. Artful replied to E, I did. Tolise said no time for Retro Festival but more than enough to get top 10 in the Discord event that was pure bullshit. Artful replied to Tolise I got 1 golden egg and I got number 10. Artful said you can check loudly crying face. E said a basic egg appears. Egg. White heavy check mark claim. Artful replied to E, I remember so many people posted that as an image. Replied to Artful I would send you the phone photo one but I can't find it so you will have to fall for this one. Artful replied to E, "Oh no, I fell for it," face screaming in fear. E said, "So can you just fall for it for me?" E said, "Thank you." Artful replied to E, "Thumbs up." E replied to Artful, Artful replied to E, "Manipulation by respecting." E said, "I mean, that's so sad that at this point you might give it to them." Artful replied to E, "So helpless to the point you do it for the bad guy." Artful said, "Where did Tolise go?" E replied to Artful, "Toilet." Tolise said, "Bathroom." Tolise said, "Had to yellow paint the toilet." E said, "See? I got cameras on him and shit." Artful replied to E, "OFC, you got cameras in the restroom." Artful said, "Out of all places." E said, "Duality of a retro individual." Tolise said, "It depends on how it gets implemented." Tolise said, "But either way." Artful replied to Tolise, "I kinda want it." Tolise said, "It will double the daily play count." Artful said, "Retroality." E replied to Tolise, "Trading only available to the Retro Builders Club." E said, "Imagine." Tolise said, "Double or triple TBH." Tolise said, "People love to trade." Tolise said, "Don't sleep on that." Artful replied to Tolise, "I see so many peak projects but none of them have came out yet, and if they did it probably would double the play count." Tolise said, "Trading is just as addicting as getting limited in real time." Artful replied to Tolise, I just like the thought of it being a thing." Artful replied to E, "Isn't Roblox trading normally only exclusive to premium?" E replied to Artful, "Yes, and it sucks balls." Artful replied to Tolise, "Quadruple." Tolise replied to Artful, "I think that trading is one of the things that will double the player count no matter what." Artful replied to Talise, I honestly don't think it will. Cheese said, TS again bro. Artful replied to Cheese, where you finding this bro? Cheese said, front page. Talise replied to Artful, it will get another player base here. Artful replied to Cheese, wait, SRSLY? Cheese said. Artful replied to Talise, pet sim 99 player base browski. Talise said, kids love to gamble. Artful replied to Cheese, oh my god. Talise said, what can I say? E replied to E. I would love to trade on Roblox again, but I don't want to spend on this shitstorm of a platform. Cheese said. Talise said, gambling and trading walk side by side. Artful replied to Talise, do they love to gamble or cry they don't get the huge one? Cheese said, let's see what's going on. Artful replied to E, blame countries across the world. Talise said, also consider that. Artful replied to Talise, I just hit the jackpot, speaking head. Talise said, most people can't trade in Roblox. Cheese said, really thinks he's tough. Artful replied to Cheese, anything goes on the first page bro. Cheese said, dangerous Dan AHH trees. Artful replied to Cheese, roaches 313 face screaming in fear. Azriel said, buying all Star Wars sale items knowing I won't use any of them and only wanting for them to go limited in the future. Artful replied to Talise, me for example. Cheese said, so fucking scary. Talise said, there is a game just about simulating trading and it gets 100 players daily, mind you, there is no real currency. Artful replied to Cheese, Timmy tough knuckles. Talise said, 100 players trading nothing for nothing. E replied to Cheese, MF, this almost looks like a game that I made. Cheese said, badass Brady. Artful said, me with all the April Fool's items. Artful replied to Talise, crypto. E said, trading when the new limiteds were coming out was so good. Artful replied to Talise, I'll take that deal, money mouth face. E replied to E, guaranteed profit. Artful replied to E, what loudly crying face. Talise replied to E, how many players do you think trading will bring to Retro Studio daily? Cheese said, these poses look so ass. Artful replied to Talise, if they keep limiteds in stock they will prob get spikes but not exactly constant players throughout a day. Talise replied to Cheese, so rough. Artful replied to Cheese, hello there good sir. E replied to Talise, I honestly think that you are overstating the numbers, it's at most gonna be a 30% player increase. Talise replied to Artful, you underestimate the people who spend all day trying to get a limited chi appear for a game they barely pay. Talise said, it's an addiction. Artful replied to Talise, not for me haha. Talise said, it tickles that part of your Artful replied to E, this looks like it would be on the front page for a good week. Cheese said, what are we doing anymore? Talise said, slop. E replied to Artful, that was the point of TS. Artful replied to Cheese, OMG, have my character added out of the millions, they're drowning out mine. Tolise said, do you guys think that the 2026 eggs will be limiteds or just retro? Artful replied to E, cash grab, pouting face. Artful replied to Tolise, limiteds and retro. Azriel replied to Tolise, you probably know what item I will try to get when it's out. E replied to Tolise, they will def be all limited. E said, unless they wanna change something. Tolise replied to Azriel, egg of destiny. Tolise replied to E, we got so few limiteds this year. Artful replied to E, which they prob won't, let's be real. E replied to Tolise, maybe they will not make any new limiteds to gatekeep trading from Nugents. Artful replied to Tolise, April Fool's, limiteds are peak. Tolise said they have been changing how limiteds work since January. Artful replied to E, which ruins the whole point. Azriel replied to Tolise, no, I want my egg, Azriel egg. Tolise replied to Artful, there were only 4 this year. E replied to Artful, which they would absolutely consider. Artful replied to Azriel, why not get your egg? Cheese replied to Tolise, I'm stupid, I thought you were talking about Asriel from Undertale. Tolise said, bro didn't get his egg. Artful replied to Tolise, the giant rock, loudly crying face. Tolise replied to Cheese, you even pinged the wrong person, folded hands. Artful replied to E, okay yeah prob. Don't DM for retro, dev support said. Tolise replied to Artful, it's just a retro item. Azriel replied to Artful, isn't that just retro? Cheese said nuh-uh. Cheese said nuh-uh. E said Cheese had one job. E said folded hands. Ricky_Ollie2 said fat pig, face with tears of joy, face with tears of joy, face with tears of joy. Tolise said he is hyper dyslexic. Artful replied to Tolise, so retro. Cheese said, I suppose so. Ricky_Ollie2 said pibble egg. Cheese said, somehow my eyes are getting worse actually. Artful replied to Cheese, yuh. Cheese said, I think I'm turning blind. Tolise replied to Artful, we haven't gotten a limited in a month, I am going insane. Artful replied to Tolise, limiteds cannot be that good. Azriel said, last big limited items release was the Boston Tea Party thing. E replied to Tolise, mainly because we haven't gotten a major even either. Tolise replied to Artful, tenor.com. Tolise said, how I feel. Tolise said, when no limiteds. Replied to Tolise, meme used twice this day. Warning. E said tenor.com. Cheese replied to Tolise, this for some reason made me laugh really hard. Tolise replied to E, I think a lot of items will become limiteds once trading gets added. Artful replied to Tolise, why care for limiteds again? Tolise replied to Cheese, I love that gif. Tolise said, it's just hilarious. Cheese said, I don't know if they adding trading. Azriel replied to Artful, addiction. Tolise replied to Artful, number goes up, brain gets happy. Artful replied to Azriel, not a valid answer, in the pit you go. E replied to Artful, you will be able to get items from events that you missed. Tolis replied to Azriel, I am pretty sure someone will trade you the Azriel egg. Tolis said, I won't, cause I collect eggs. Collegus said, does anyone want to help me with ideas for my easy camera points plugin? Artful replied to Collegus, bet. Artful replied to Azriel, goal taken, never give the Azriel egg to this guy. Collegus said, currently I have. Add point, button. Assign order automatically. Yes, no, buttons. Transition time, choice. Turn on / off, button. Close window, button. Every of these are. E replied to Azriel, well, I might or might have not changed my mind, but you can give me something for it. Tolis replied to Artful, take away his copy. Tolis said, -1 Azriel egg. Artful replied to Tolis, destroy. E replied to E, is there a slim chance that you have the Steve egg and you would be able to give it up for the Azriel egg? Artful replied to E, good plan. Collegus replied to Artful, currently I have. Add point, button. Assign order automatically. Yes, no, buttons. Transition time, choice. Turn on / off, button.
Well,
Close
there.
window,
Are
button.
you lost, little
Every.
one?
Collegus said, I forgot to reply. Cheese replied to Collegus, what does any of this do? Collegus replied to Collegus, carrot. Tolis replied to cheesetenor.com. E replied to Collegus, man, TS too smart for me. Artful replied to Cheese plugin. Cheese said, oh. Artful replied to E, get good pouting face.
Two sides of the same coin. Knowing your projections
E
can indulge
replied to Artful, they just typing shit, bro. Artful replied to E, why can I understand it? E said, I can program 2C. Tolis replied to Artful, bilingual. E said, graphics equals good. Stefan replied to Artful, you didn't take your pills.
The mask you wear serves
Tolis said, controls, WASD. E replied to Tolis, cheaters equals banned. Azriel replied to E, someone offers that egg to me a few months ago for Sorcus egg when trading released. Artful replied to Stefan, seems like my pills hold me back then. Cheese said, can someone explain to me how a double jump works? Stefan replied to Artful, FR. Cheese said, in code. Collegus replied to Cheese, it's a plugin intended for people who want to easily add the camera points in custom themes levels. Artful replied to Cheese, humanoid state. Said successful equals true. E replied to Azriel, Sue, is that a yes or a no? Artful replied to, isn't it true and not true? Replied to Artful, depends. Tolis replied to Azriel, trading is kinda awkward for me because I got a lot of shit and I doubt people are willing to trade older items for what I got. E replied to Tolis, like. Artful replied to Tolis, old means more rare, no? Tolis replied to E, I am missing the 2023 stuff. Azriel replied to E, no, I'm gatekeeping annoying sound egg. Tolis replied to Artful, basically yeah. Tolis said, depends tbh. V said, how long will the items be available for? E replied to Azriel, I can add. Artful said, where my wumpus egg, loudly crying face. Tolise replied to Artful, hanging. E replied to Artful, shadow realm. Replied to Azriel, bro, don't gatekeep the Steve egg. Cheese said, mania slevia. Artful replied to Tolise, everyone else on the leaderboard got it except me. Tolise said, you got 10.5 th, place too bad. E replied to Tolise, the hanging wumpus is not allowed ! V said, the hell is going on? Tolise replied to E, he is just hanging with his friends. Artful replied to Tolise, I got 10th place, wilted flower. Stefan said, I gotta check my old event items, see if anything is worth things. E replied to Tolise, hanging out, right? E said, right? Crewmate said, I beat the stupid Drew obby in the despicable me obby made by Benny. Cheese said, 28/12 ths place. Artful replied to E, hanging can be a short term for hanging out. Tolise replied to E, yeah, whatever fits the knot. E replied to Artful, Shirei. Cheese said, how would I edit the player's limbs to my liking? Artful replied to Cheese, that's 2.333334 bro. Cheese said, I need extra help. E replied to Tolise, son. Artful replied to E, no, like it is. Tolise replied to E, whatever fits your boat asterisk. E replied to Tolise, Giphy.com. Artful replied to Tolise, isn't it whatever floats your boat? Cheese said, Sonian ring is peak. Tolise replied to Artful, since when do boats float? Artful replied to Tolise, on water. Cheese said, like floating on water. Cheese said, less dense and more dense. Typing shit. E said, cdn.discordapp.com. Artful said, I understand it all. Cheese replied to Artful, how do I edit the player's Motor 6DS with a tool? Tolise replied to Artful, restore the Chinese honor. Artful replied to E, SpongeBob X Reader. Cheese said, who's the reader? Cheese said, the player. Artful replied to Cheese, you. E replied to Cheese, holy ready player 1 ref. Artful replied to Tolise, not you browski. E replied to Tolise, it was already restored. Tolise replied to E, tenor.com. E said, I restored it yesterday. Tolise said, thank you, son. Tolise said, for restoring China. Artful replied to Cheese, work a tool like a plugin? Cheese said, no, like a regular tool. Tolise said, now we must make a new Transformers movie. Artful replied to Tolise, Agora. E replied to Talise, I actually identify as Sony Bun, that will be minus 50 social credit for you. Cheese replied to E, Sunny Bunny Runny Funny. Artful replied to Cheese, like, do you have to change the motor to something specific to what the player wants? Cheese said, fuzzy wuzzy wasn't very fuzzy was he. Artful said, Retro Studio, the movie. Cheese replied to Artful, no, just set the motor 6D to a specific position when equipping a tool. E replied to cheesegiphy.com. Talise said no one would trade the snail egg. E replied to Artful, starring Irai. Talise said, I am missing out. Talise said, on peak. E said, we, yes we, all gatekeeping snail egg. E said. Boom clap said emoji boozy snail. Cheese said, can I get onesie? E said, anybody here even has it? E said, or am I just surrounded by a bunch of LARPers? Talise replied to E, I will acquire it. Artful replied to Cheese, when the tool is equipped, find the motor 6D you want in the player's character, as when a tool is equipped it's transferred to the character, and set the properties to what you. E replied to Talise, acquire ALR bro, it's just an egg. Sumkit guy said, is anyone? Talise replied to E, how many limiteds do you have? Sumkit guy said, a scripter here RQ. Sumkit guy said, who scripts with block coding in here? Artful replied to E, am I a LARPer for winning the Wumpus egg but never being rewarded it? E replied to Talise. E replied to Artful, yes. Artful replied to E, IITS not my fault. Talise replied to E, so you aren't a LARPer after all. E replied to Talise, told yeah. Talise said, how many do you think I have? Artful said, Emma, eat a donut. Talise replied to Artful, I cannot allow it. E replied to Talise, 531. Talise replied to E, not too far. Talise said, I have 511. Talise said, missed some sale stuff.
Still here. You just keep on going, don't you? Well, the next door has been fixed up for you. So enjoy and keep
Stefan said dem you guys got bunch of limiteds. Stefan said I only got 42. Tolise said we are limited LARPing. Azriel replied to E, gatekeeping the Louis egg too. Tolise said 2025 had like 200 limiteds. Stefan said how long are the Star Wars items gonna stay up for? Artful replied to Cheese where is the tool located before the game even starts? Tolise replied to Stefan tomorrow. Stefan said shit. Tolise said I will answer you tomorrow. Cheese replied to Artful the tool is in starter pack. Stefan said oh. Artful replied to Cheese you don't need player added and character added. Noob39RT said LMFAO the ship is mad. E, replied to Stefan May 4th, 2027. Noob39RT